SEP Readings presents Accidental Proposal by CJRed. Chapter 17. Champagne and Witches. Hermione woke up slowly and snuggled into the warmth surrounding her. It took a moment for her to realize that she was not in her bed and that she was not alone. Before she could begin to be startled, Draco's scent surrounded her and she smiled. Lifting her head to see that she was wrapped in his arms, she noticed that he was still asleep. She looked around and saw that she was in his dorm room. Her brother was asleep across the way with his curtains open, probably to make sure that Draco wouldn't try anything with his sister. She smirked and looked over a bit farther to see that Blaze's curtains were drawn, clearly unconcerned that Draco had a girl in his bed. She looked back at Draco and saw that he was still fully dressed, as was she. She reached up with a tentative finger to trace his full lips, waiting for him to wake. Slowly he blinked open his gray eyes and kissed her fingertip in greeting. "I fell asleep," she said in a whisper. He nodded and hugged her tighter. "I didn't mind," he whispered back. She smiled at him and then glanced over at her snoring brother. "Did he?" Draco smirked and reached over to take her hand in his, lacing their fingers. "A bit." She shook her head, and then let out a soft hiss as he shifted, and she felt his hardness. He flushed and moved away a bit. "Sorry," he said softly. She shook her head and sighed, dropping her forehead onto his chest. "Do you think it's the magic causing this need?" Draco was silent for a minute, and then she felt him shrug. "I'm not sure," he finally said, his tone soft and a bit troubled. "Does it matter?" Hermione shrugged and sighed again, looking up at him, her blue eyes wide with desire. "It's becoming distracting. The more I touch you, the more I want to." Draco nodded and ran a hand through her hair before he cupped her head and pulled her up so that their lips were a hair's breadth apart. "Oh, trespass sweetly urged. Give me my sin again," he whispered with a grin before he crushed his lips to hers. Hermione wasn't sure what turned her on more, that he had just quoted Shakespeare to her, or that he was now kissing her. As his tongue swept into her mouth, she let out a breathy little gasp and moved her free hand up to tangle in his hair, shifting her body so that his hardness was cradled at her core. He broke the kiss, breathing heavily, and leaned back. He closed his eyes before he said, breathlessly, "If we don't stop, Theo will murder me." Hermione smiled but took a deep breath and pushed herself upward, kissing his nose before she rolled over and stayed very still, trying to catch her breath. "What time is it?" she asked after a minute. She felt him grab his wand and then said, 4 a.m. Hermione sighed and sat up, taking her hand back. She started to pry his soft duvet off of her, yawning. "I'm going to go back to my bed to hope for a few more hours of sleep." Draco rolled over, frowning at her. "You can sleep here." She rolled her eyes and leaned down to kiss his cheek. "I wouldn't sleep." He grinned and pulled her down, rolling so that he was above her and kissing her senseless again, until she was shoving half-heartedly at his shoulders, gasping with desire. "Draco," she moaned softly as he kissed down her neck. He sighed and rolled off to the side, allowing her to get up. They both froze as Theo let out a loud snore and rolled over. Horrified, she looked at him with eyes wide, and he smirked, shrugging. "Sorry," he mouthed at her, knowing she must be mortified that they'd been making out with her brother asleep in the same room. She playfully swatted him and grabbed her shoes, rushing out to his muffled laughter. Later that morning, she found herself sitting with Theo in the common room, sipping tea after a bit of a lie-in and a lazy breakfast. Draco was out at the Quidditch pitch with Blaze. "Draco told me you agreed to meet with his mother," Theo said into the silence. Hermione sighed. "When they were in France waiting for the sentencing from their trial, it was easy to ignore them at first. But now that Lucius is in Azkaban and his mother is under house arrest, I guess I feel obligated." Theo snorted. If they hadn't tried to appeal against the sentence, he'd be out of Azkaban on good behavior by now. Hermione nodded wearily. "Well, no one expected Lucius to go quietly into the night." Theo grinned and then sobered. "Are you going to be okay going to the manor?" Hermione rubbed her arm tiredly. "I have to be, don't I?" "Why?" Theo asked curiously. Because Draco needs me to be. I don't really know a lot about what happened to him there, but I get the feeling that he hates the place as much as I do.
Theo nodded, his face going soft. So you were just going to bury your pain to help him with his?
Hermione shrugged in response, shifting uncomfortably. I've seen his scars, Theo. He got those from his father. At least the person who sliced into me didn't pretend they loved me.
Theo sat back, stunned, and exhaled slowly. True, he said after a long moment of silence.
Hermione sighed wearily and rubbed at her eyes. I'm worried about him. I'm not sure he can forgive them, and his mother will need him. She has never done well alone.
Theo looked at her, shocked at her knowledge. How do you know that?
Hermione shrugged. A simple deduction, based on what I know about his mother. She surrounded herself with people the last time Lucius was in Azkaban.
Theo nodded thoughtfully. Yeah, that's true. She can't throw parties or have friends over now.
Draco is all she has left, Hermione said softly.
Theo shook his head. That's not good for Draco either.
Hermione nodded. I know. That's why he will need me to be strong. I will have to set boundaries with her so that Draco is protected.
Theo smirked. No offense, sis, but you kind of suck at that.
Hermione glared at him and then sunk into the couch. I know, she groaned lowly.
Theo chuckled and put his arm around her. Chin up. Pansy can teach you how to be a bitch. What will I do? Pansy said, walking into the common room and heading for the teapot. Teach Hermione how to survive tea with Narcissa and set boundaries. Basically how to be bitchy, yet polite.
Can you be polite and bitchy at the same time? Hermione asked with a frown.
Pansy snorted. Of course you can. When is tea?
Hermione shrugged. Soon, I think.
Pansy sipped her tea and frowned before she squared her shoulders.
Well, we have to go shopping first. You have nothing appropriate for tea with Narcissa Malfoy. Aren't you lucky I just organized our portkey for this afternoon?
Hermione groaned.
I was afraid you'd say that.
Pansy smirked evilly.
And we will have to hold etiquette lessons. You Gryffindors have no sense of tact or proper table manners.
Hermione sat up, growing annoyed.
Hey, I have table manners.
Pansy waved at her.
Tea in pure-blood society is like a dance. Every move is critical, from how many sips you take to how you put the cup down. Trust me, you have no idea what you're getting into.
Theo snorted and leaned back with a grin. We had to take lessons for years, he confirmed with an eye roll. Bop will help. She taught me.
Pansy nodded and set down her mug. Right, call your elf and let's get started. Bop set up a tea table with a full tea service in the dorm room, and all of the girls showed up to help, even Ginny, who, surprisingly, had shrugged and said that if Hermione had to learn, she would suffer with her. It took the entire rest of the morning before Bop and Pansy felt Hermione would not embarrass them. Ginny was pretty helpless, and Bop, being Bop, told the girls sternly that she would meet with her 1 hour every afternoon to make sure she didn't embarrass herself in polite society. Ginny nodded solemnly and held her laughter until after the elf left. Hermione rolled her eyes in annoyance because she had been told that she was expected at tea with Ginny. She has been teaching me subtly every time I take tea with her. I didn't realize I was being trained, Hermione said in a groan as she fell onto her bed.
Pansy chuckled. Elves are good at stuff like that, and you should thank her because she is probably why you aren't a lost cause like Weasley here. Ginny tossed a pillow at Pansy.
Hey! The girls sat around reading for another hour before they all stood around the portkey to head to Paris for the scheduled shopping trip. Pansy, of course, had taken over and was in her element. Hermione found that the simplest way not to develop a migraine was to just nod and smile, because Pansy was a force to be reckoned with. Even Ginny was stunned as she watched the witch work her magic. "How did she perfect that face?" Ginny whispered curiously. Tracy looked up from the catalog and smirked. "Which face?" Ginny gestured at Pansy, who was sneering at the shop witch, who had brought out allegedly substandard robes for Pansy to look at. "That one." Tracy tilted her head and then shrugged. "Some are born with the talent to terrify others." Daphne snorted and looked up from her catalog. "Pansy was definitely born with that ability." Ginny giggled as Pansy yelled for Hermione to head back into the dressing room with another selection of outfits to try on. Hermione groaned softly but stood up obediently. She owed Bop an apology because the little elf was tame compared to Pansy when it came to shopping. 3 hours later, Pansy declared Hermione ready to face any and all wizarding functions for the rest of the year. With that, the group departed to Muggle London to find her a dress for her first date with Draco. "You will need to buy a new outfit for every date," Pansy said, her tone stern. Hermione rolled her eyes. "Why?" Tracy, who had her arm linked with Daphne's, chortled. "Because you'll be photographed." Ginny shook her head. "Good thing you're rich now, Hermione." Hermione shuddered. "I think I rather liked being poor better," she whispered to Ginny, who shook her head. Tracy snorted at them. "You don't have to be rich. You can borrow things from us if you need them, Ginny. Magic makes tailoring very easy." Ginny turned to Tracy with a smile. "Thanks." Tracy nodded kindly, and then her eyes twinkled. "So, when Blaise asks, be sure to raid our closet. With Blaise, you can certainly wear black." Ginny went pink as all the girls giggled. Pansy, however, looked Ginny over. "Your size is pretty standard. We can raid second-hand shops easily for you. You won't need to be wearing this season's fashions like Hermione does." Hermione shook her head. "Lucky me." Everyone ignored her. Surprisingly, picking out a dress for her date turned out to be rather fun. The girls all sipped Muggle champagne and gave a thumbs up or thumbs down to each dress Hermione tried on. By her third glass of champagne, she was tipsy enough to not mind the whole process, and started picking out some dresses herself. The Slytherin girl stuck to green, while Ginny kept trying to get her in red. Hermione finally settled on a pale blue cap-sleeved dress, with a full skirt that she loved to twirl in. It came down to her knees, and had a sweetheart neckline that reminded her of a dress she had seen in a picture of her grandmother from the 50s. Pansy added a pretty pink belt with a soft pink shoe to match. Hermione loved it, and everyone agreed that it looked amazing on her. However, they decided to finish off another bottle of champagne, and pick out a few more dresses since they were having so much fun that it seemed a shame to leave. When they took their portkey back to the castle, they all collapsed in giggles in the common room as the guys looked at them with raised eyebrows. "What in the hell have you gotten into?" Blaise asked curiously. This caused the girls to giggle more as Pansy handed their packages off to Bop, who was shaking her head sternly. "Whatever it is has left them far from sober," Draco said with a grin as he watched Hermione fall onto the couch, and Ginny landed practically on top of her. Theo nodded and then rolled his eyes. "I am slightly worried if it causes Pansy to act like a loon." Pansy waved at him, giggling. "Oh, bugger off, all of you!" Draco had to hide his laughter as he backed off, with the two others watching, as the witches continued to giggle. "Don't suppose someone hexed them," Theo whispered. Draco, who had finally caught on, shook his head, laughing. "They must have gone shopping in Muggle Paris." "Why do you say that?" Blaise asked curiously. Draco smirked. "Because this is how Pansy acts when she drinks a Muggle spirit called champagne." Blaise and Theo raised eyebrows as they followed Draco into their room. "I think I will buy stock in this drink," Blaise said when they made it to their room. Theo snorted. "Why?" Blaise winked. "Ginny was stripping as we left." Theo and Draco threw glances at the door and looked like they might rush back out as Blaise stepped in front of them. You two can stay put. No one will bother them, and we can send elves over later to get them to bed." Draco groaned and threw himself on his bed as Theo snorted and Blaise chuckled. 2 hours later, when there finally was silence in the common room, they sent the elves in to get the witches to their beds. Hermione moaned as she woke up with the worst hangover she had ever had in her life. Beside her, Ginny moaned as well and threw a pillow over her head. "Someone find me a hangover potion," Pansy moaned from across the room. "Will it work with Muggle alcohol?" Ginny mumbled through the pillow. Pansy groaned and said, "Yes." Hermione called for Bop, who popped in, gave her a stern look, and then popped back out, hopefully to get them some hangover potion. She heard the girls calling for their elves and let out a small gasp as the pops sounded around the room. Thankfully, Bop came back with hangover potion, as well as headache reliever and a pitcher of water. Ginny thanked the little elf sincerely and quaffed her potions before grabbing a glass of water. "I am never shopping with you lot again," she said after a moment. Tracy giggled as she stretched after taking her potions. "I suppose we might have stopped after the third glass." Pansy snorted. "Speak for yourself. That's when it got fun." Daphne laughed. "I think we worried the boys. Did you see them staring at us when we got back?" Pansy shrugged. Draco knows about Muggle champagne. I am sure he informed Blaise and Theo what was going on. Hermione sat up and looked down at herself. Where are my clothes? Ginny snickered. Mine are missing too. Pansy laughed. I think I remember stripping in the common room. It was very warm. Hermione covered her face with her hands in horror. Oh, Merlin, I hope Theo didn't walk out and find us in our knickers. Daphne laughed and shook her head. They would have let us alone. It's an honor thing. Ginny looked up in surprise. Even Blaise? Tracy smirked. Especially Blaise. Ginny looked over at Hermione. I think we have misjudged snakes. Gryffindors would have been taking pictures to use against us later. The 3 Slytherin girls looked horrified, while Hermione went a little pale. Oh, could you imagine? Seamus would have had a field day with this. An hour later, everyone had bathed and dressed, and the girls were nursing tea in the common room, as the guys returned from breakfast. They live, Theo said teasingly. And are dressed, Blaise said with a wink, causing Ginny to blush. Draco came over to smirk at Hermione, who rolled her eyes at him and scooted over to make room for him to sit beside her. How are you feeling? He asked, still smirking at her. Fine, she said, leaning into him. He sighed and grabbed her hand, running his fingers along her palm, and caused her to shiver. I got a letter from my mother this morning, he blurted. Hermione looked over at him with a raised eyebrow. Do we have a date for tea? I will have to check with McGonagall, but pending her permission for the use of her flu, we can meet with my mother next Sunday. So, after our first date at least, Hermione said softly. I still want to hex the weasel for postponing that for us. Hermione smiled up at him and shrugged. I won't stop you, she said cheekily. He leaned down and kissed her softly. Hey, none of that! They both grinned at each other as Theo was hit in the head with a pillow by Pansy Parkinson. Leave them alone! Well, at least Pansy is on our side, Draco said with a grin. Hermione chuckled and cuddled back into him. That's always a plus.